What I will say is I think I finally understand when people get sick of, like, Tolkien's pages and pages of description for things and their eyes just glaze over. Because Jane Austen does the same thing with a lot of her dialogue. You would be surprised how easy it is to miss reading some classic authors if you don't just go out of your way to do it. So, that is what I did, and I picked up Jane Austen's Emma on the recommendation of my Jane Austen obsessed friend who said that this is objectively, unarguably, Jane Austen's best book. And I trust her on that, and I assume that there's no bias, and that no one disagrees with her. But before we get started, tell me your favorite classic novel down in the comments below. Mine would probably be 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or 1984 by George Orwell. I just love the ideas that both of those discuss. And I want to be clear, this is not what I usually read, not only because it was published over 200 years ago, but because it is a romance novel. And I have read books with romances, and I've read books that are about romances, but doing a romance novel in particular, not really my thing, usually. But a book this much about romance is kind of a new thing for me. So with all of that, take everything I say with, you know, a truckload of salt, because I am not an expert on Jane Austen or her writings or other writings like this. Anyways, what is Emma about? Emma is about a girl called Emma, who doesn't want to marry herself, but likes matchmaking the people around her. Except, she's kinda crap at it, and keeps making everyone around her miserable through her attempts to pair people together, and messing it up almost every single time. And then at the end, she marries a man called, and I kid you not, Mr. Knightley, because, you know, knight in shining armor, probably. Okay, he's not perfect, but he also doesn't want to marry, just like her, and who would have thought that these two people who definitely don't want to marry end up marrying each other in the end. Having finished this book, I can also conclude that Jane Austen at some point in her life must have had a really erotic ballroom dance with someone and has just been never able to let it go. Because apparently that is just the pinnacle of flirtation. The best way for me to capture what reading this was like was, you know those YA novels where, like, every character is snarky and witty and can always clap back because the author seemingly thinks that those are the only interesting types of characters? Well, it's like that, but good, because conversation without understanding is kind of a big theme in this book, and from what I know, a lot of her other writings as well. You know, people will say a lot of stuff, but not what they truly mean. And that's a big source of the conflict and Emma's mistakes in this book, because conversation is more treated as like an intellectual battle where you're trying to outwit the other person to take the high ground in a way. And so you get a lot of subtext and characters trying to interpret one another, which results in a lot of those types of characters. At the same time, it's really taking potshots at English society at the time, where expressing yourself kind of authentically and your emotions was a little bit frowned upon. You were kind of expected to do it a little more subtly. Emma is in a way a critique of that society and the frustrations and even the pain that comes with that. And so our main character is kind of scandalous because she is so openly spoken about how she feels and what she wants. But she is also manipulative and sly and witty, and that comes out in her dialogue with a lot of that clever phrasing. I think what really worked for me was the tone of the book. It's very cozy, like you're never too worried anything terrible is going to happen, and it's kind of comedic, it's a little bit satirical, and it lets you kind of just lean into the characters and go along for the ride with them, which is not something I usually read. But because that tone and satire comes so much from the historical context of when this was written and what it was commentating on, I think me having a bit of knowledge of that time period really enriched my experience with the story. And if you don't necessarily have that, you may not pick up on some of those layers to it, and you may not enjoy it as much. And that's fine, these sorts of stories just come with that context. What I will say is I think I finally understand when people get sick of, like, Tolkien's pages and pages of description for things and their eyes just glaze over, because Jane Austen does the same thing with a lot of her dialogue. Do not get me wrong, the dialogue is brilliant, but characters will take like 200 words to say something that could have been said in 10. And again, that's part of that miscommunication thing, you know, characters saying things, but it's more about what they can do with the words than what the actual words are. But at the same time, my eyes just kind of blurred over some of the dialogue, which will just go for pages and pages and pages back and forth without telling you sometimes who is speaking. And you'll get to the end of it and I'll feel like, wait, what did they actually say across all of this? And it'll be like one small thing that I pick up, you know? And it's because of that dialogue that the two main characters, Emma and Mr. Knightley, were so vivid for me. They really jumped off the page with their unique voices. If you've ever read anything by Oscar Wilde, it's a lot like that. It's got that same clever, quippy, brilliant, you know, snappiness to it. But the characters around those two, a little less so. There are a lot of characters in this book that it expects you to remember. A lot of Mr. This and Mrs. That, and some of them change their names across the story, and it does not help that she does not really use dialogue or action tags to tell you who is talking, and so there will be times where you read a passage and you'll be like, wait, who said that? And you'll have to go back to make sure you're tracking who's saying what. So just be prepared for, wait, who was that? Was that the priest or the farmer? And how does that person relate to that person? Ugh. And maybe I just wasn't paying attention. It's possible, but that's not usually a sort of thing that I suffer from. Still, I do want to read you just like a little bit of her writing, because she has this knack for these really clever like opening lines and prose, which are so iconic Austenian lines, I suppose. And I'm gonna open the book so I can pretend I'm reading from it, but the quote's actually on the phone there because I forgot what page it was on. All right. Human nature is so well disposed towards those who are in interesting situations that a young person who either marries or dies is sure to be kindly spoken of. Now, isn't that cool? I just love that. It's got that very a man in possession of a great fortune must be in want of a wife. I don't really want to critique Jane Austen. She is one of the most well-loved and well-reputed authors of all time. My thoughts on that front, probably not that helpful. I'm just talking about my experiences with it. But I do want to mention, you know, coming from kind of the sci-fi fantasy readership world, which I know a lot of you guys are more connected to, what it is kind of like. It is unlike anything you have probably read. There's a much weaker sense of place I found in this book. You know, fantasy and sci-fi tends to take a lot of time easing you into the world at hand and you can visualize everything, and this book doesn't do that nearly as much. As I said, if you don't know much about English society at the time, then some of these beats may not work for you as much, but do I recommend reading it? It's kind of one of those if you want to questions. You know, if you're only interested in reading science fiction and fantasy, then no, probably not. But if you're wanting to more deeply engage with kind of the English literature canon, because Jane Austen is a cornerstone, important part of the stories that we write now and where that history comes from, then she's a great place to start, a great place to look. And if you're wanting to diversify and increase your knowledge of the English literature canon, which was kind of what I have been doing, I want to read more diversely and have a deeper understanding of the culture that I am swimming in, you know? For me, it's a personal enrichment thing. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I won't say this book tugged me along from page to page. It's a hefty book at 160,000 words on its own, and I was glad to be done with it, not gonna lie. But I am glad to have read it, and I feel I learned a lot from it academically, and I understand a bit more about the giants upon the shoulders of which we stand now. So I will leave the decision in your hands, and if you have read Jane Austen, or read a lot more Jane Austen than I have, then please tell me about how right or wrong I am with my thoughts down in the comments. Stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.